The numbers are just staggering. We're hearing that the entire population of Gaza is projected to face high levels, acute levels of food insecurity.
Yeah.
And maybe 500,000 people could be facing actual starvation by September next year. It's almost unbelievable.
It is. And what makes it even more urgent, frankly, is that vital aid, the food, the medicine people need, is reportedly being blocked from getting in.
It's a crisis that just screams out for, deeper understanding than the daily headlines sometimes allow.
Absolutely. The potential scale of human suffering here, it really forces us to look closer at the underlying issues, especially, as you say, what's hindering that aid delivery.
And that's exactly what we're trying to do here on the Deep Dive. Today, we're wading through a lot of information that can feel overwhelming about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, focusing specifically on this current crisis in Gaza. We've looked at recent reports, timelines, different analyses, basically trying to give you a clearer picture.
Right. Because it's easy to feel overloaded, isn't it? This conflict is so long-running, so complex, so emotionally charged. Our goal today is really just to offer a concise but thorough overview. We'll touch on the key events happening now, the humanitarian disaster unfolding, the legal questions, and we're drawing from a mix of sources, news reports, human rights groups, academic work to try and give you a solid foundation.
Okay, so let's jump right in. Where do things stand right now, say, as of May 17th, 2025?
Well, Israel's ground offensive, which they've called Operation Gideon Chariots, has expanded. The stated reason is to put more pressure on Hamas, specifically to release the hostages still being held. So that means intensified military operations across different parts of Gaza.
And at the same time, there are truce talks happening again.
Yes, indirectly. They've resumed in Qatar. Hamas, according to reports, is demanding, a permanent end to the war, a full prisoner swap, Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, and crucially, unrestricted aid access.
And Israel's position.
Their stated goals haven't really changed. Free the hostages and dismantle Hamas's military capacity. What seems significant is that both sides apparently went into these latest talks without preconditions.
But the human cost just keeps climbing.
Yeah.
It's horrific. By May 14th, so just a few days ago, the Palestinian death toll was reported over 52,928, with almost 120,000 injured. And then on the 17th alone, reports of at least 70 more Palestinians killed.
And we also have to remember the Israeli side. Over 1,600 Israelis and foreign nationals killed, mostly on October 7th, 2023. Plus, since the ground operation started, 414 Israeli soldiers killed. And estimates suggest around 58 hostages are still captive. It's loss on all sides.
Beyond the deaths, there's the displacement. It's massive.
It is deeply troubling. Since March 18th, over 436,000 more Palestinians have been forced from their homes. And what's really concerning is they're being pushed into smaller and smaller areas, places already overcrowded.
Right.
Actually, figures suggest something like 71% of the entire Gaza Strip is now either designated a militarized zone by Israel or under evacuation orders issued since mid-March.
So squeezed into less than a third of the territory.
Essentially, yes. And despite these talks in Qatar, the fighting hasn't stopped. Hamas is still claiming attacks on Israeli forces on the ground.
Which brings us squarely to the humanitarian situation. You mentioned aid being blocked. Since March 2nd, there's been a full blockade imposed by Israel.
Yes, a full blockade. It severely restricts essentials, food, water, medicine, fuel. It's gotten so bad that the UN relief chief basically called a joint U.S.-Israel aid plan a waste of time.
Why a waste of time?
Because the aid might be there nearby, but it's not getting in effectively. This has led to some very strong accusations, of deliberate obstruction, even a systematic dismantling of what Palestinians need to survive.
And the food insecurity you mentioned at the start, it affects everyone.
The entire population, that's what reports are saying, facing acute food insecurity. And that projection, 500,000 facing potential starvation by September next year. It's terrifying. We're getting credible accounts of families literally starving while food sits waiting, unable to get through. And tragically, children are reportedly already dying from malnutrition and dehydration.
God, it's awful. And what about healthcare?
It's essentially collapsed. The system was already weak, but now major hospitals like Nasser, the European Gaza hospital, they've been hit, severely damaged, or forced to close at times.
How many are still working?
Over 63% are only partly functional, maybe less. They're facing critical shortages of everything. Medicines, supplies, surgical services have broken down in many places. And the cost to healthcare workers themselves, over 1,400 reported killed, it's staggering.
And attacks on hospitals are still happening.
They are. Sources we looked at documented 686 attacks on healthcare since October 7th last year. That affected 122 facilities and 180 ambulances. It's a systematic issue, it seems.
Unbelievable. And water, sanitation.
Also a crisis. People are getting less than 5 liters of clean water per person per day. That's a 94% drop from before. Not nearly enough for basic survival, let alone hygiene.
Why so little?
Infrastructure damage is huge, but there are also severe restrictions on getting materials in for repairs. It compounds the problem.
And buildings generally. Infrastructure.
Widespread destruction. Over 60% of buildings in Gaza are reported as severely damaged or destroyed. That includes schools, 62% of school shelters. Many housing displaced people have been directly hit. And amidst all this, think about the aid workers trying to help. At least 430 have been killed, including 305 UN staff. The danger they face is immense.
This level of devastation, the blockade, the attacks on civilians and infrastructure, it inevitably raises questions about international humanitarian law, IHL, war crimes.
Absolutely. And it's crucial to understand IHL applies to all parties in the conflict, Israel and Palestinian armed groups like Hamas.
And the rules aren't reciprocal, right? One side breaking them doesn't excuse the other.
Exactly. That's fundamental. IHL governs how the fighting is done, but also the responsibilities of an occupying power, which is relevant here too.
So what are the potential war crimes being discussed?
Well, things like deliberately attacking civilians, hostage-taking, collective punishment, these are all prohibited. There are serious allegations against Hamas, particularly concerning the October 7th attacks, deliberate killing of Israeli civilians, taking hostages, and firing rockets indiscriminately towards Israeli towns and cities.
And the allegations against Israel.
Those include indiscriminate airstrikes and very densely populated areas, the reported use of white phosphorus in those kinds of areas, which is restricted. Also, collective punishment through the blockade, restricting food, water, fuel for the entire population. Willful blocking of aid is another major allegation.
And the displacement.
Unlawful displacement of civilians, yes. And also the issue of transferring Israeli civilians into occupied territory, that the settlements issue, though that's more related to the West Bank historically, it's part of the same legal framework.
You mentioned occupation. How does that apply to Gaza? Israel withdrew troops in 2005.
It's a complex point legally. While ground troops withdrew, Israel retained significant control over Gaza's borders, its airspace, its coastal waters, its population registry. Because of this level of control, many international legal bodies and scholars still consider Gaza occupied territory. And under IHL, an occupying power has obligations to ensure the basic needs of the civilian population.
Like food and medicine.
Exactly. Things that are currently allegedly being restricted. And accountability is the big question hanging over all of this.
Is anyone investigating?
Yes, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, has an ongoing investigation into alleged crimes committed in the occupied Palestinian territory that covers actions by all sides. But these investigations are complex. They face challenges like jurisdiction, state cooperation. It takes time.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit. What are the wider consequences, strategically, regionally?
Well, one perspective is that Israel might have achieved some tactical military goals, degrading Hamas's immediate fighting ability. But there seems to be a lack of a clear political plan for after. Who governs Gaza? What's the long-term strategy? Without that, there's a real risk, analysts say, that Hamas or something similar could just reconstitute itself down the line.
Has this affected Israel's relationships in the region, like with the Arab states that were normalizing ties?
It seems to have had a significant impact. Some analyses suggest the initial October 7th attacks and the subsequent war demystified the image of the Israeli military's invincibility in the eyes of some regional actors.
Now, sir.
Well, part of the logic behind normalization for some Gulf states was aligning with the perceived security powerhouse. If that perception shifts, the calculation might change. We've seen Saudi Arabia, for instance, now very publicly linking any further normalization steps directly to tangible progress towards a Palestinian state. That's a much firmer line than before.
And the sheer level of violence.
Yeah.
Does that have broader effects?
Tragically, yes. Experts are warning about increased radicalization across the Arab and Muslim world. The argument is that the scale of killing and suffering might be creating more extremists than are being eliminated militarily. There's concern it could fuel radicalism among both Sunni and Shia groups, tapping into narratives of resistance and grievance. Extremism breeding extremism, basically.
What about the U.S. role? How is that being perceived?
The U.S. position, often seen as very closely aligned with Israel's, is definitely having repercussions. Statements and policies from Washington are, in many parts of the Muslim and Arab world, interpreted as conflating U.S. and Israeli interests. This has reportedly led to a rise in anti-American sentiment in some places.
And does this distract from other global issues?
Some strategic thinkers argue yes, that the intense focus and resources demanded by the Gaza conflict potentially divert U.S. attention from, say, competition with Russia or China. We're also seeing some Arab countries perhaps hedging their bets a bit more, exploring stronger ties with other global powers in this changing landscape.
It feels like we need to touch on the history, even briefly, because none of this happens in a vacuum.
Absolutely not. It's built on decades, even centuries of history, and it's vital to acknowledge upfront that there are starkly different narratives, different interpretations of that history.
Like,
well, for instance, the deep historical and religious connection of Jewish people to the land versus the Palestinian experience, particularly their narrative of displacement and dispossession, especially since the mid-20th century, both are deeply felt realities for the respective peoples.
key turning points people should maybe be aware of.
You have the 1948 war, which led to Israel's establishment, but also the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, what they call the Nakba, or catastrophe. Then the 1967 war, which resulted in Israel occupying the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights, the Nakba, or setback for Palestinians. And then decades of, well, failed peace processes. Attempts like Camp David, the Oslo Accords. They raised hopes, but ultimately didn't resolve the core issues like settlements, borders, refugees, Jerusalem.
And Palestinian identity itself.
It's also shaped by these events. While Palestinians have lived in the region for centuries, a distinct national identity really crystallized, many historians argue, during the 20th century in response to Zionism, the British Mandate, the conflicts, and the rise of Arab nationalism generally. We also can't ignore the role of outside actors influencing the dynamics, like Iran's support for Hamas, for example. It adds another layer of complexity.
Okay, so as we try to wrap up this deep dive, what are the main takeaways?
I think, first and foremost, the sheer scale of the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza right now, it's almost unimaginable. Second, the fact that intense fighting continues, even as these truce talks are happening. There's no real let-up on the ground. Third, the really serious allegations of war crimes against all parties involved under international humanitarian law.
And fourth,
the significant, far-reaching consequences this is having regionally and perhaps globally, politically, strategically, and in terms of human sentiment and radicalization.
it's just incredibly complex, deeply rooted issues, no easy answers in sight.
None at all. And hopefully this discussion has given you, our listeners, maybe a clearer framework for processing the news, for understanding the different layers of this crisis.
Yeah, because the information we've gone through today, it's heavy, it's distressing, and it's okay. It's completely understandable if you feel concerned or angry or just overwhelmed.
Absolutely.
So maybe a final thought to leave people with. When you look at this cycle of violence, these deep-seated grievances on both sides, the tangled web of regional and global interests, what kind of fundamental shift, maybe in thinking or in approach, could possibly be needed to even start moving towards a future that's genuinely sustainable, genuinely just for everyone living there?
That's the crucial question, isn't it? It forces you to think about how interconnected everything really is, the history, the politics, the human cost.
Yeah.
And if you do want to dig deeper into any of this, we really encourage you to look at the sources that informed our chat today and also seek out other credible perspectives. There's always more to learn, especially with something this complex and ultimately this profoundly human.